Last weekend, Susie and I were invited to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library for the dedication of the Air Force One Pavilion, the Ronald Reagan Pub, and for a reunion of senior Reagan officials. It was an exciting and moving two-day trip. It's hard to believe, but they actually have an entire Boeing 707 Air Force One inside the building. It's something that you all should see. It's incredible. The trip, though, was far more serious than that. It served as a reminder of my time working for President Reagan and just how big and how important the presidency remains. It's a daunting job, and while Ronald Reagan handled it with his characteristic grace and good humor, his successors, Republican and Democrat alike, have struggled at times with its challenges. I've been involved professionally in 5 presidential campaigns and numerous primaries, and I increasingly question what the campaign for president has to do with actually serving president or being president. The presidency should not be about sound bites, clever slogans, or slick advertising. It should be about leadership and character. Simply to seek the presidency, to throw one's hat into the ring, is a commitment beyond which most of us can imagine. Author Richard Ben Cramer puts it best: what in their backgrounds could give them that huge ambition, that kind of motor, that will and discipline, that faith in themselves? What kind of faith would cause, say, a dozen of these habitual winners to bend their lives and the lives of those dear to them to one hugely public roll of the dice in which all but one would fail? The man for whom this institute was named would have been a terrific president. But he would be the first to admit he never mastered sound bites, trusted the advice of spin doctors, or was willing to put his own career ahead of what he thought was best for America. The Contenders series is designed with Senator Bob Dole's mission for the Dole Institute in mind. Our purpose is to provide a forum for the men and women who may choose to seek the presidency, a forum to show leadership and character and, should I say it, their vision for America, and to do so away from the partisan rancor that seems to dominate Washington and before the heat of the campaign tempers their judgment. Our goal is to give the voters of Kansas, you, an opportunity to meet as many of these as individuals as you possibly can, to kick the tires, so to speak, to decide if they have, as Richard Ben Cramer says, what it takes to be President of the United States. We'll be extending invitations to all the candidate possibilities, but ultimately who takes advantage of this opportunity and what the partisan and philosophical mix of the participants is will be determined just by them and whether or not they accept. But I do want to thank you for embracing us, this program today, and for being here. We owe a particular debt of gratitude to our guest today. His early commitment to our program is allowing us to begin the series with a person of incredible substance who may very well be the next President of the United States. To formally introduce our guest, I'd like to present Professor Jonathan Earl, our Associate Director of Programming. John?
Thank you. Just a program note. After the formal remarks, the Senator has agreed to answer some questions. So please keep, if you are chosen by one of our interns who will have microphones, handhelds, please keep your questions short. That means no speeches. And please make them questions. It is an honor to have today's speaker kick off our new Contenders series. Delaware's voters first elected Joseph R. Biden, Jr. to the United States Senate in 1972 when he was 29 years old. Over the past 3 decades, he's played a pivotal role in shaping our nation's foreign policy as the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee. A student of history, as a history professor, I have to throw that in whenever it's relevant, Biden brings a common-sense approach to the complexities of American foreign policy issues. But foreign affairs are hardly our guest's only bailiwick. His position on the Senate's Judiciary Committee, which he chaired from 1987 to 1995, means that during this season of Supreme Court nominations, you literally cannot turn on the Sunday talk shows, or Imus in the Morning, or The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, without seeing Senator Biden on the screen. He has also been instrumental in crafting virtually every major piece of crime legislation over the past 20 years, including the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, That's a mouthful. That's why they call it the Biden Act instead. And the Violence Against Women Act of 2000. As a summer resident of Bethany Beach, Delaware, I can personally thank the Senator for returning to Delawareans more than 1,180 acres of beach shoreline, some of the nicest in the nation. And to help Americans struggling to afford rising college tuition, and I see a few people here today who this is an important issue for, Senator Biden has long been a staunch supporter of a plethora of aid and loan programs and has offered legislation to allow families to deduct up to $10,000 per year in higher education costs from their annual tax returns. Senator Biden grew up in Newcastle County, Delaware, and graduated from the University of Delaware in 1965 and from the Syracuse University School of Law in 1968. Since 1991, he has also been a professor teaching constitutional law at Widener University. He lives in Wilmington, where he commutes to work every day on Amtrak, and he and his wife Jill have 3 children and 4 granddaughters. It's no secret that our guest has long been a presidential contender, first running for the Democratic nomination in 1988. I guarantee you're going to be seeing a lot of, and a lot more of, our guest in the coming weeks and months. It is my pleasure to welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, Senator Joe Biden.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, folks. Thank you. Thank you very much. Director Lacey, thank you for those kind references. One of the great honors was to have at least a partial biography written about me in the same volume they wrote about Bob Dole. And I want to have a full disclosure to all of you students and faculty here. I'm a Bob Dole fan, and that is not hyperbole. That's literally true. Bob Dole and I were friends for all the time he was in the Senate, at least the 33 years that I've now served in the Senate. And I've had great respect for him. And I was going to paraphrase what Director Lacey read about what it took. And Bob Dole, the reason why so many of us across the aisle admired Bob Dole, because it is clear to me Bob Dole never put his career beyond what he thought was good for the country. Whether or not he was being wounded in Italy, and I had the great honor of being with him on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, the liberation of Rome, before that with Bob Dole. And it was a time that I had the honor of convincing Bob to divert from Rome to Croatia, when I was at that time the only voice saying we should be involved in the Balkans because genocide was occurring. And Bob Dole, to his credit, got on a plane. We got a small plane, and we went. Bob Dole, Elizabeth Dole, my wife Jill and I. And I watched the reaction of Bob Dole in the hospital in Sarajevo, where the only people in the hospital were children, because the Serbs had decided to use high-powered rifles on the Muslim section of old Sarajevo to maim and destroy children, not adults, in the hope that they would drive the Muslims out of Sarajevo. And I watched Bob Dole. I watched Bob Dole as we went to this hospital. If you ever saw the movie The English Patient, you know those big old hospital walls of tile that went up 18 feet. That's what the hospital in Sarajevo was like. We walked from room to room. There were very few people. It was during a so-called ceasefire, except for the targeting of children. And I watched Bob Dole. We walked in the room where a raven-haired young beauty of 13, 14 years old, who looked and followed our voices, but a bullet had gone through with a high-powered rifle through the back of her head, out the side, and severed the optic nerves. She was blind. And I watched Bob Dole. If anybody ever wondered whether that hard shell was one that was not a layer over a heart as big as his head and compassion for people who've been hurt, you all had to just be there. I remember Bob Dole as the man when I first got there, who was the guy that really genuinely was a compassionate conservative. He was conservative in the traditional sense. He is conservative. but he also is the man who engineered and changed the lives of millions of Americans who are disabled with the Americans with Disability Act. I miss Bob Dole. I miss him in the Senate because he was a man of integrity whose wit occasionally got him in trouble, but his intellect never failed him. And I'm happy to be here at an institute named after him, and I'm happy to be here. And there's another reason I came. I wanted to know whether there was a single Democrat in the state other than Karen McCarthy. I didn't, you know, back east we wondered whether that was true or not. And my sister Valerie, who's with me, and my sister Valerie, my much younger sister, who's managed every one of my campaigns from the time we were very young, also wanted to come and see whether there really was a Democrat on the prairie. I don't know. I want to tell you, I'm extremely flattered that anyone would be here. I understand this is homecoming weekend. It's a beautiful day. It's Friday afternoon. I don't know what the hell you're doing here, but thank you. I don't know why. My God, when I said I would do this at the only time I could have a shot of not missing votes, my sister Val said, what are we going to a college on a Friday afternoon at homecoming for? Who will possibly show up? So I am very flattered. Thank you for anyone being here. And I was thinking, Bill, when you talked about and what a distinguished career you have had. What a distinguished career you have had, and the work you did in the Reagan administration with another man of great integrity. I disagreed like the devil with Ronald Reagan, but it was impossible not to like him. Impossible not to like him. You know, the press was, I shouldn't digress this much, I'm going to make this speech too long, but the press was asking me about Myers being brought down. I remember I had a strong disagreement with Bork. I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and I worked very hard. And Bork was intellectually honest. He confronted the issue straight on. And I felt very strongly his vision of the Constitution and where it would take America was very different than we should have. And so I worked very hard to see him not go in the court, even though I had great personal respect for him. And after it was all over, I got to tell you a Reagan story you may or may not be familiar with. Howard Baker was then his chief of staff. And I got a call, typical Reagan. He said, well, Joe, he said, can you come down to the White House, the Oval Office, and talk with me about the next nominee? I said, of course, Mr. President. So I didn't plan on telling this story, but so I walked, I went down, walked in, and the president was behind the desk, and he ambled over. He really did amble. He ambled over to, you know, hello, and he big grin, and he grabbed my hand, and he said, congratulations. I said, no, congratulations in order, Mr. Chairman. I said, it was very devastating for Bork. He said, nah, he wasn't much anyway. And I looked at him, and remember, he was angry because Bork blamed him because of remember Bork saying, because of were it not for Iran-Contra, the president would have had enough power to get me through. And I don't think the president liked that. I don't know, but I assume that. And he looked at me and he said, well, who do you want, Joe? And I said, Mr. President. And I told him the story about Senator Borah in the late 20s. Was called down by the president. The president gave him a list, and he reached in his pocket and handed him a list. It had 10 names on it, so the story goes. Whether it's apocryphal or not, I don't know. And he handed Senator Borah the list. And Borah took the list and said, it's a great list, Mr. President, except it's upside down. And he handed it back to him. Well, I told him that story. I said, Mr. President, I'd be delighted to tell you and give you an honest assessment of what I think is how the Senate will react to whomever you send up. But that's all I can really do, Mr. President. And Howard Baker was, and Howard was a close friend. And I said, and still is. I said, but, you know, Howard Baker, no one knows the Senate better than Howard does, Mr. President, so he'll be a check on my judgment. So we sat down, and Reagan took out a card. President Reagan, I never called him that. President Reagan took out the card. He said, well, what about Posner? I said, oh, Mr. President, I said, that'll be a rerun of Bork. It'll be a Donnybrook. He said, all right. He said, how about Wade McCree? Remember Wade McCree, black Solicitor General in, I think, the Ford administration? I said, Mr. President, he'd go through like a hot knife through butter. He said, well, what about Souter? And only because I had a pretty good staff, I knew who Souter was, but nobody really. I said, Supreme Court, State of New Hampshire? He said, yeah. I said, I don't know enough to give you an opinion, Mr. President. He said, what about Tony Kennedy? I said, from the state of Florida? I mean, from the state of California, Supreme Court Justice? He said, yeah. And I said, I think he's conservative, not who I would pick necessarily, but I said, he'll pass, because we had done a lot of research on him. I said, he'll pass. He said, that means you're for him. And I said, Mr. President, based on what I know, I'd be for him. He said, well, Joe, you're for him then, huh? And I said, Mr. President, I didn't say that. I said, based on what I know. I said, if he is what he appears to be, yes. And he said, well, you're for him then. And I looked at Howard. I said, Howard, tell him, will you? And with that, swear to God, you'll associate with the story, if not known about it. He said, you got another minute, Joe? And I joked. I said, Mr. President, I'm a very busy man. And he said, no, do you have another? I said, of course, Mr. President. He stood up. We were in front of the fireplace with those armchairs, those wing chairs. And we walked over, and although I've been a United States Senator since President Nixon, I had never been in that side office that caused so much trouble for Clinton. You know the one I mean? The one where it's, in the wall, the door is in the wall. And we walked over, and we're looking at the wall where he used to have those Remington, there. And I wondered what we were doing. And all of a sudden, the door opens. And standing in the doorway is Tony Kennedy and his wife. And he looked at Justice Kennedy. He said, Tony, Joe's for you. Wily old guy. Wily old guy. So I know why he was able to get Air Force One inside a building. Which reminds me of when Nixon was running for president and Bob Dole's famous phrase. Remember he was running as well? And they asked Bob Dole, he said, do you want Nixon to visit Kansas? And Bob Dole's response was, I have no problem in flying over at 30,000 feet. At any rate, enough of that. I apologize for taking so much of your time because I do want to talk about a serious subject with you, if I may, and it's going to take me about 22 to 25 minutes with your permission. And we have an old story where I come from. My job is to speak. Yours is to listen. If you all finish your job before I finish mine, raise your hand and we can all go outside, okay? Folks, my colleagues always kid me because I'm quoting Irish poets, as I told the press a little earlier. And they think I quote them because I'm Irish. I don't. I quote them because they're the best poets. But the truth of the matter is, there was a poem written by William Butler Yeats. It's called Easter Sunday, 1916. And it's about the first rising in the 20th century in Ireland against English rule. And there's a line in that poem that I would argue describes America and the world in 2005 better than it described his Ireland in 1916. It says, all's changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty has been born. Well, folks, 4 years ago, the events of 9/11 made crystal clear just how fundamentally the world has changed. China, breaking into the world community, has demonstrated just since 1992 we have 1 billion more people in the workforce than we did in 1992 competing for the same jobs. That day on September 11th made it clear, though, that America faces in my view, two overriding national security challenges in this new century. First, we must win the real struggle between the rise of radical Islamic fundamentalism and freedom. And secondly, and maybe equally as importantly, we have to deal with the spread of weapons of mass destruction and keep those most dangerous weapons out of the hands of the world's most dangerous people. For the first time in human history, a group of individuals, not another nation state, can present an existential threat to a nation. And they have no territory to defend, no armies, they have no populations to defend. This gathering, in my view, is an opportunity to step back and ask, how are we doing in meeting those twin challenges? The short and honest answer is, not as well as we could, or not as well as we should be doing. And I believe we need a new approach, and that's what I want to speak about today. It is contrary and opposite of this administration's view on foreign policy, and I might add there are Democrats who disagree with me on this. But as an old saying goes, that old joke about the Texan who said, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. I've been doing this for 33 years, and I know what I believe, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. I think this administration is full of incredibly bright, patriotic Americans. We refer to them as neocons. This is not the fringe of the Christian coalition. These are serious, serious people. They're among the brightest academics in the nation. And they know what they think, and they mean what they say. So I don't question their motives, but I have profound doubts about their judgment. First, this administration has demonstrated, in my view, far too narrow a definition of what constitutes national security. Yes, national security first and foremost is whether or not there are existential foreign threats, but it is also the physical security of our homes and communities, job and health and retirement security, and energy security. It is increasingly, in this increasingly interconnected world, these different aspects of security are tied together as never before, and the way we pursue one profoundly affects the others. The second point I'd make is this administration relies much, too much on a limited arsenal of tools in the President's foreign policy kit in order to secure our country's future. After a necessary war in Afghanistan and a war of choice in Iraq, Americans are rightly confident about the example of our power, but some of our leaders have forgotten about the power of our example. For all the great might we possess, we are more alone in the world than any time in the history of this republic, in my view. And as a result, we are, in my judgment, less secure. I believe we have to recapture the totality of our strength, to rely on our force of arms, yes, but also on the power of our ideas and our ideals. In short, we have to be strong and smart at the same time. Now, what does that mean for our nation's foreign policy? In my judgment, a strong and smart foreign policy requires four things be done differently. First, we have to rebuild or build in the first instance effective alliances and international organizations. Secondly, we must forge a prevention strategy to diffuse the threats to our security long before they're on the verge of exploding. And third, when prevention fails, and we must use force, we need to develop a new consensus on the circumstances in which force is appropriate. And fourth, we must focus our resources on reforming failed and anti-democratic states that are the source of instability, radicalism, and in many cases, terror. Let me start with the first part of this new approach, building strong alliances in international organizations. Some of my friends in the current administration have, as we've all observed, little interest in alliances, international organizations, or treaties. And there's a logic to their disengagement. They start with the basic premise, it's important to understand, that America's military strength is the single most important factor in the international system. Because that might is so much greater than any other nation, they see our allies and agreements as more of a burden than a benefit. As they have written, if you've read them, they talk about us being Gulliver, tied down by the Lilliputians. And how do the Lilliputians tie us down? With international organizations, alliances, and treaties. I start from a very, very different premise after 33 years of doing this. Our military might is essential to our security. But most of the threats we face in the 21st century, radical fundamentalism, the spread of weapons of mass destruction, rogue states that flout the rules, infectious disease, environmental degradation, economic dislocation, none of these have any respect for borders. And not one of these threats can be met solely with unilateral or even multilateral military force. Although Iraq, I might point out, demonstrates the price we pay when it's unilateral and not multilateral. We didn't need a single solitary troop other than Americans to defeat Saddam Hussein. But because we chose to wage that war virtually alone, we have been responsible for its aftermath, as Senator Lugar and I both predicted before the war, virtually alone. As a result, 90% of the casualties, 90% of the cost have been American casualties, American cost. And the prospects of leaving Iraq a unified, stable, and democratizing country are even more remote today than they were at the outset. But we shouldn't learn the wrong lesson from our mistakes in Iraq. Yes, we're far better off leveraging our power working with allies through international organizations. But the credibility and effectiveness of those organizations and alliances depends on a willingness not only to live by the rules, but to enforce them when they are violated. So we are not, nor do I blame nor do I blame Bush alone. The French acted irresponsibly, and the Germans acted irresponsibly. Not as irresponsible, in my view, as we have in misunderstanding, misleading, and misinforming the American people. But they have not acted responsibly. We could have had a basis for a common approach with our closest allies in Iraq. It was not to be done. And both the United States and Europe have paid a heavy price, and I would argue will pay an even heavier price for the failure of both America and Europe to act more reasonably. I'm happy to talk about where we go from here in some detail in the question and answer period, but for now, just let me say this. No matter what you think about this war, about whether, when, or how we should have gone, about the way the war has been managed or mismanaged, no matter what you think about these things, we now have a fundamental national security interest at stake. For Iraq risked becoming a Bush-fulfilling prophecy, to become what it never was before the war, a haven and a training ground for radical Islamic fundamentalism, and devolving into a full-scale civil war that I predict, if it occurs, will result in a regional war, where our interest will be affected for the next decade. So any responsible policy, in my view, must take into account what we can still do, if anything, to prevent that outcome, even as we try to bring our troops home as soon and safely as possible. The only thing more irresponsible than going in without a plan, as we did, is leaving without a plan, as we might. Let me turn to the second part of my approach, rejecting the administration's preemption strategy and forging a prevention strategy that diffuses the threats to our security long before the only choices left to us is either do nothing or act unilaterally with force. Neither good options. This administration's effort to turn military preemption, which was always an option available to every president of the United States of America, to turn this option into a one-size-fits-all doctrine has been and remains, in my judgment, both dangerous and destabilizing. It says to rogue states, this preemption doctrine, it says to rogue states that their best insurance policy against regime change is to acquire weapons of mass destruction, and to do it as quickly as possible. I believe that's one reason why North Korea's nuclear arsenal has apparently grown 400% in the last 4 years. And it also gives a green light to India and Pakistan, Russia and Chechnya, China and Taiwan, to use force first and ask questions later. And it sets virtually no standard by which our own people or the international community can judge whether the use of that force was legitimate. It requires a standard of proof for intelligence that may be impossible to meet unless we cut corners, as I believe this administration did in Iraq. A true prevention strategy would bring to bear all the weapons in our foreign policy arsenal. It would put much more emphasis on programs to secure and destroy weapons of mass destruction and fissile materials in Russia and beyond. The so-called non-Lugar legislation, which, like G.K. Chesterton's comment about Christianity, he said it's not that Christianity has been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and left untried. It's not that non-Lugar does not work. It is that the President has not pulled the full force and authority of his administration behind the continued destruction of these materials. I would also fully fund Homeland Security budgets to detect and respond to terrorist attacks. It would include new international laws to seize suspect cargoes in the high seas and international airspace. It would involve a new international alliance of law enforcement experts and intelligence and financial officers to uproot terrorists and end their funding streams. A prevention strategy would provide a much tougher non-proliferation strategy, including no-notice, on-site inspections, and a reformed non-proliferation treaty to close the nuclear loophole. It would require reinvigorated public diplomacy to explain our policies and expose the lies about America around the world by us showing our warts and all, to let people understand that there's genuine credibility to this nation's assertions. And it would require, the most difficult thing, a sustained commitment to the development and democratization, to prove to people around the world that we offer hope and our enemies offer nothing but hatred, which I'll come to in a moment. But if America commits to a policy of prevention, not preemption, we also need our allies to rethink their policy on the use of force. Building a new consensus on the use of force is the third piece of what I would call a new approach to American foreign policy. The first thing we must do is engage our allies in a real dialogue about the nexus of the threats we face, radical fundamentalism and the spread of destructive weapons. And that nexus requires a new response. Containment and deterrence got us through the Cold War. And they are still valid strategies for dealing with rogue states, including Korea and Iran. But they do not suffice, I would respectfully suggest, when the enemy is a stateless actor with no territory or people to defend, who is amassing stealthy weapons instead of amassing armies we can see. That's why a broad prevention strategy is so important. It's also why our allies and other major powers of the United Nations Security Council must be willing to get much tougher with rogue states who harbor terrorists, seek weapons of mass destruction, pose as proliferation threats, or engage in wholesale genocide within their borders. And that's why my own party must rethink their attitudes towards the use of force. I recognize that for some, maybe many of you in this room, going to war can never or almost never be justified. I respect that opinion, but I strongly disagree with it. Back in the 1990s, I was the one, as some of you who follow this will remember, and I know Karen does, who urged President Clinton to go to war in the Balkans. I'm the guy that came back from Srebrenica and Tuzla and Sarajevo and said there are rape camps, there's genocide going on, there are mass graves. I stood in Tuzla when the evacuation of Srebrenica was taking place and ran down as these big UN dump trucks came in with people People crowded in like cattle cars. And I couldn't understand why some were holding their children over the side of these trucks. Until with a group of Irish aid workers who were on site opened the back of the dump truck. There's a suffocated child on the floor because they could not move. It was genocide, plain and simple. So, folks, there are circumstances in which the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648 or thereabouts, which established the principle of state sovereignty 4 centuries ago, simply shouldn't hold. For I believe when a nation engages in wholesale genocide, even within its own borders, it forfeits its right to sovereignty. It took time for that argument to prevail in the Balkans. U.S. and Europeans finally joined forces and reversed the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. Then we acted even more quickly to turn the tide with the great help of Bob Dole, one of the few Republicans on the other side of the aisle who stepped up. We saved hundreds of thousands of lives, and we lost virtually no Americans. Not in battle, because we did it the right way. We were strong and smart, and we met the moral obligations of a great nation. Now it seems to me we should apply the same logic to states without democratic checks that seek to amass weapons of mass destruction and harbor terrorists. That's exactly what we did in Afghanistan. And some of you are so strongly opposed to the war in Iraq, and I can fully appreciate why, because it's been so badly handled. Ask yourself the question, was the war in Afghanistan justified? Do you support the continued presence of 30,000 American troops in Afghanistan? Would you, were I president, and they came to me and said, I know where Osama bin Laden is and Mullah Omar and the Taliban, but to get them will cost 2,000 to 3,000 American lives. Would you support my use of that force? Well, folks, it's a good internal test to ask yourself, because if there was ever a war that was justified, it was the war in Afghanistan. If there was ever a war justified, it was the war in Afghanistan. As I said, I wonder how many people in this nation, in this room, support that action before we went in, or continue to support the use of American forces in Afghanistan. In short, folks, I think we got a lot of soul searching to do. In short, I think my party has to reach a consensus. In short, we have to have our allies around the world, when they say, abide by the rules of international conduct, to say yes. But when they are violated, what will you do? What will you do? Let me conclude with a few thoughts about the fourth piece of what I consider to be the new approach that is needed. And that's bolstering failed states and working to expand democratic institutions. Folks, in the 21st century, I believe failed states are cracks in the foundation of an international system. There have always been poor countries whose people suffer under corrupt, incompetent, and ruthlessly barbaric leaders. It's always existed. What's new is the threat their decomposition poses for our own security. Today, the problem on the far side of the global village can become the plague on everyone's house very rapidly. That's why we must challenge ourselves and our allies to refocus our attention, reallocate our resources, and reform our institutions to address the challenges of the 21st century. Failed states. Together we have to take seriously the task of economic development. We and our European friends. We have to commit to further debt relief. We have to buffer countries against economic shock. We have to give them the tools to combat corruption and dramatically expand our investment in global education. It seems to me we should reorient the international financial institutions that exist and the UN for the purpose of stabilizing these weak states. The United Nations, as we learned, is not the vehicle to prevent war in the first instance, but it is capable, if it changes its focus, it is capable of stabilizing weak states and thereby preventing war. And we have to lead the world in a massive effort to combat the scourge of disease, especially AIDS, but not just AIDS. We also have to take seriously what some people in Washington, particularly in this administration, consider a four-letter word: nation building. This administration came to office disdaining the concept of nation building, only to be confronted with the two biggest nation-building challenges since World War II, Iraq and Afghanistan. And we've failed thus far at both, one more than the other. I'd like to see us empower experts at the front end now. Were I president, I'd be asking the experts in this country to plan for post-conflict reconstruction ahead of time, not on the fly. To build a standing roster of international police organizations, a gendarmerie, to handle security after tyrants are toppled. To create a system to rapidly stand up and train indigenous forces. A notion we squandered badly the last 2 years in Iraq. For when it comes to wars of choice, I think there have to be cooler heads say, think twice. We are good at projecting power, but we demonstrate it. We are not so good at staying power. I was asked early on what I thought the greatest threat to American security was before the war in Iraq when I was chairman. Korea or Iraq? And I said, by a factor of 10, Korea. And then pointed out what Brent Scowcroft, the first Bush's national security advisor, what Jim Baker, the first Bush's Secretary of State, what Dick Lugar, the leading Republican foreign policy expert, said. We better prepare if we go to have staying power. It will cost us hundreds of billions of dollars. This is not Monday morning quarterbacking. Anybody want the reports we wrote before we went? I'll be happy to supply them. It will take tens of thousands of American troops, and it will take a minimum of 5 to possibly 10 years to stabilize and restore anything closely approximating democracy in Iraq. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems to me there is only so much the United States and the world's major democracies can do, but there is much they can do together to help build democratic institutions, especially in the greater Middle East. Not with reckless campaigns to impose by force from the outside democracy. That has never, 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 never worked. But by working with modernizers within those countries to build the institutions of democracy over the long haul, political parties, independent media, independent journalists, transparent economics and accountable governments, modern education, NGOs and the civil society, a vibrant private sector. And the single most important and significant thing we could do would be play a part with the rest of the world to empower women in the Arab world. It is not hyperbole to suggest, and I'm not the only one, a group of Arab scholars writing a report for the United Nations state the single most significant thing that could be done to bring stability to the Middle East would be empower the 50% of the population that is out of the loop. Name me a single democracy in the 20th, let alone the 21st century, that is able to sustain that democracy. But the abuse or the ignorance or the ignoring of the women in their population. Our Democratic friends, though, one of my problems, and I've been chairman of NATO's committee for years and years. I've known every major European leader for 33 years. Some of them I grew up in politics with, and they're now in power, and I have personal relationships with. There is an arrogance, a chauvinism among Europeans that those of you who are mad at Bush tend to forgive them for. and that is that they are cynical as hell. And I believe they possess the wrong view that some societies, as they say, are just fundamentally incapable of transforming themselves. That's not true in my view. It is true. It's hard. It's frustrating. It takes time. But I believe it can be done, but quite frankly, for our own safety's sake, it must be done. There are 1,400,000,000 Muslims in the world. 1,400,000,000. And well over 1,300,000,000 of them are decent, honorable people whose religion is not an impediment if you study it. It's the bastardization of that religion and the unwillingness of us in the West to engage them in a debate that allows the lowest common denominator to prevail. I once reminded President Bush, who always likes to talk about the Bible, God love him. And by the way, I've never said this before. Congresswoman McCarthy knows me well. I'm a practicing Catholic. Up until a month ago, I never ever said that publicly in 33 years of my life. I just practice it. I say these things. It matters to me. But an interesting thing, the way we use religion today in domestic politics is used as an organizing political tool rather than a road to salvation. And the president sometimes liked, when I'm in the Oval Office, to talk to me about that. And I respectfully reminded him that the walls of Jericho did not fall as a consequence of advancing armies. It was Joshua's trumpets that fell the wall. And the Berlin Wall did not fall as a consequence of American tanks blowing holes through it. Our force was necessary, but not sufficient to bring that wall down. To win the Cold War, it was our ideas and our ideals that permeated that wall, that unilaterally brought down the wall without a shot being fired. Gone too long, but I can't resist telling you a very quick story. When Lech Walesa came to see me after Poland and declared its independence and expelled Russian troops, he walked in my office and walked across and gave me a big hug. And he said, "Thank you." And I said, No. Thank you, because I've been involved with Solidarity. He said, "Thank you." I said, "Solidarity." He said, No. The Holy Father and Radio Free Europe. Folks, it seems to me foreign policy is not a popularity contest. We must confront very hard issues, and sometimes they require us to make hard choices that other countries won't like. But above all, they require American leadership, the kind that persuades others to join us, and we've been having a tough time doing that these past few years. And I believe we do pay a price for being this world's sole superpower. But that's a reality, we are. But I still believe that most countries recognize deep down their need for America trumps their resentment for America, that they have much more to lose from our indifference than they do from our engagement. And folks, if we act with strength and wisdom, if we are persistent and get a little bit lucky, if we follow our values in a tough-minded way, I truly believe we have a chance to rebuild our power to persuade, to restore this nation to the respect it once enjoyed, and to literally change history on the margins. This is an incredible opportunity that we have. I'll end where I began, with an Irish poet. Seamus Heaney won the Nobel Prize for Poetry in the mid-90s with a poem called The Cure at Troy. And there's a stanza in that poem that should become our anthem, in my view. He said, and I quote, History teaches us not to hope on this side of the grave, but then, once in a lifetime, that longed-for tidal wave of justice rises up, and hope and history rhyme. If we are true to who we are and have a little luck, I think we not only can but have an obligation to make hope and history rhyme. Thank you for listening.